Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone, back with Ben Gretch for the second to last episode of the off-season projection special. Want to shout out Ben for all his help on this podcast, all the work that he puts into it. Also, Jack Miller, Mark Dankenbring on the ETR team helping me with the projections. You can check Ben's work out at bengretch.substack.com. We're going to do the AFC East today. We'll start with my Buffalo Bills. I've got the Homer shirt on for this podcast. But right off the bat, Gretch and I are super aligned on the team play calling stuff. Have the Bills at just over 64 plays per game and right around a 60% called pass rate. For me, I would note, I feel like there's a lot of volatility in where the pass rate could be for this team. People will point to what Joe Brady did down the stretch last year where they ran a ton. Part of that to me reminds me of like the Eagles a few years ago where like they found something that was working and the games went a certain way and they just stuck to it. Like I'm not super worried they're going to go crazy run heavy this year. But I could see this swing, a few points in either direction.
I wrote in my notes, I was super curious to see where you have the plays in the pass rate, given your fandom and your knowledge of the team and all that. And it's really cool to see that we're this close. You mentioned we're just over 64 plays per game. I have data going back 4 years in my spreadsheet. That's at least a half play per game lower than anything they've had in the last 4 years, right? So we're both expecting a slowdown based on what the Bills have been and based on, we're going to talk about the coordinator change in season last year quite a bit, I'm sure, based on the way they looked after Joe Brady took over as the coordinator down the stretch last year. And then, as you mentioned, the pass rate, we both have right around 60% called pass rate. I always reference my expected pass rate based on Vegas win totals. This for me is about a +1 pass rate over expected, or that's what I'm projecting. Last year, they were basically neutral, which was a huge, like at the end of the season, which was a huge huge diversion from the previous 3 years where they were basically at least +4%. So we're both saying +1%. And that's despite the second half of the year was more run heavy to get them back to neutral. So, but I think it's fascinating that we both wound up, as you just said, in terms of the way this could swing both ways, going back towards the pass a little bit relative to what they did down the stretch.
Yeah. And they had games under Brady -9% PROE, -8%. They had 2 games in a row where they were right around -16%. They had that game against Dallas at home in bad weather. So it's pretty crazy. I think you put it well. Relative to what they've been historically, they're going to be more run heavy, but probably not as run heavy as they were down the stretch last year.
And we should give Pat Thorman a shout out too. He had great offseason notes about how the offseason move signaled that the change might be kind of the new normal. The Diggs and Davis departures.
They bring in Samuel too to do some stuff. They also only drafted 1 wide receiver. They still drafted a running back when teams thought, they could pursue that.
That's right.
The wide receiver position a little bit more aggressively.
I wrote the draft. I couldn't figure out what draft pick I was referencing, but the Ray Davis draft pick. Yes. Yeah. He mentioned as well.
The good news for Josh Allen is Brady was not afraid to use him as a rusher, and his rushing touchdown upside was so high that even in some of those run-heavy games, he was fine as a fantasy asset. Gretch has him at 400 fantasy points for the season. I got him at 361, which is a little bit lower. Probably I'm skewing a little bit too conservative on the rushing side of things. Gretch has about 100 more rush yards and 2 more rushing touchdowns. It's tough for me to project the rushing touchdowns. Like Allen and like Hurts and those guys are such outliers. I believe Allen had 15 last year, and that's always been kind of a hallmark of his game is his ability to run for touchdowns in the red zone.
But that's a big question for his value this year because it was his first year over 10. He's always had at least 6 in a year, every year of his career. He's had multiple seasons, 8, 9. But 15 last year was the outlier. The reason I'm projecting in a base double digits again is because including the playoffs where he had 3 and 2 games, he had 11 rush TDs in his final 8 games under Joe Brady. They went much heavier toward, so he had 18 rush TDs total, 15 in the regular season, 3 in the 2 playoff games. 11 of those came in the 8 games under Joe Brady. The other 7 came in the first 10 games. So more like, 0.7 per game, right? And then in the later part, it was more like almost 1.5 per game, almost doubled his rate of rushing TDs per game. And I do think we talked a lot about the ways that defenses are playing these teams and that kind of stuff. I do think part of what Joe Brady said and did as a coordinator was we have to it's similar to what Shane Steichen has said about Anthony Richardson so far in training camp. Like, are you going to stop Steph Curry from shooting threes? We have to let Josh Allen be the dynamic playmaker that he is. That's when our offense is good. Now, they were pressing because they were 5-5 after the coordinator shift, and they needed to make the playoffs, and everything was a little bit more urgent down the stretch. So there is some concern there. It's tricky to project Allen's rush TDs. There's not a multi-year sample like there is Hurts of double-digit rush TDs, and yet I ended up projecting Allen not far off from Hurts this year based on what he did down the stretch.
Yeah, and did want to know with the Hurts comparison, the Bills will do the tush push. They did that somewhat frequently, and they even did it, at times 4th down in their own territory, which is, like you said, they were a little bit desperate last season, but I think the biggest change from the coordinator from a fan perspective from Dorsey to Brady was maybe like in EPA per play. It's like, ironically, they were like basically the same in all these advanced metrics, but there might have been a little something to finishing drives more. And that comes back to using Allen in those short yardage
multiple rush TDs in 4 of 8 games. I mean, like that's what they were doing in close. That's how they were finishing drives. Multiple rush TDs, like in all these games. I mean, I don't think you can go away from that completely, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's just so effective. And that's what I said with like the Hurts stuff. And we'll do the NFC East last. Like, and I think it's finally been dispelled. People were like, oh, they're not going to do the tush push now because they have Barkley. And it's like, it's such an effective play. You're not going to stop doing that. Maybe a little bit. Maybe you'll scale back, but you're not just going to stop doing it. But anyways, as we get to the running backs, it's kind of funny because like collectively we have the running backs for like the same amount of touchdowns as Josh Allen. When you aggregate all of them, of course, we both have Cook as RB1. We're at 203 carries. Ben's at 212. So very close there. Targets wise, Ben's at 62. We're at 55. Again, for people listening the first time, Ben's stuff runs a little bit more aggressive, our stuff a little bit more conservative. So I would interpret these lines like very similar projections and outlooks in terms of how we're looking at James Cook. He ran a little bad last year I saw an Ian Harden tweet about how Cook dropped 4 touchdowns. And it's on one hand, it's really bad to drop 4 touchdowns. On the other hand, how many running backs are even in a position to be able to drop 4 touchdowns? So he had a pretty good season. I know you were on him last year, but there was some meat on the bone for sure for Cook as well.
Yeah. And one of the cool things about him, I talk about this occasionally because it only pops up occasionally, but newsletter subscribers will know that I get excited about running back air yards. He's had meaningful air yards for a running back the last couple of years, and it just provides a little bit of spike upside. Like you're talking about, he's dropped some of those plays, but he had 76 air yards as a rookie, 112 last year. That doesn't sound a lot for anyone who's done air yards research, but most running backs typically have an ADOT of about 0 because they catch a lot of passes behind the line of scrimmage. This means his ADOT's like more like in the 2.0 range. He's actually getting some downfield targets. So that's a little bit rare for receivers. It's helped him to good yards per target figures for a running back. It's helped him to good receiving TD rate so far in his career. Also saw a slight uptick in targets per game after the OC switch. So I'm pretty bullish on his receiving upside. When we get to the wide receivers, we'll talk about how there's some target earning question marks. I think James Cook's going to catch. I got through this projection and I was like, man, he's going to catch a lot of balls this year. Like he's going to actually be used as a vertical weapon in the passing game. Like we think of like a Christian McCaffrey gets used sometimes.
Yeah, I think, if you're bullish on Cook, a lot of it is he does what he does last year with more big plays that he left on the table. And just the type of player he is, we can expect, I think, maybe more big plays than he's shown and some of those resulting in touchdowns because we really don't have, a huge touchdown projection on him right now, about 7 touchdowns for us. I think you're a little closer to 8, but very similar. The one slight concern on Cook catching a lot of balls, it's very early on in training camp, but like Ray Davis has been used as a pass catcher early on in training camp a lot more than I expected. And then I never know how much to buy into like the Curtis Samuel playing out of the backfield stuff, but they've been doing a lot of formations like that. But anyways, Ray Davis, I've struggled with because on one hand, he's one of those rookies where I'm like a little worried, like we overly assume has the job. Like I still think Ty Johnson's probably going to play more than than people want. At the same time, if the Bills do scale back Allen in the red zone a little bit, like it's probably going to be Ray Davis. It's not going to be James Cook in super close in most situations. And it does seem like he has a little bit of the Latavius Murray role for Buffalo, which had some value, but then you just throw in a guy that does that plus a little more, plus is actually potentially good.
Yeah. I mean, I'm basically thinking of Ray Davis in that Latavius Murray role. Like you said, I maybe am not projecting enough targets, but I did also have a similar note where I was like, Ty Johnson's probably more draftable than he gets credit for, with like actual upside as a contingent play on Cook. He's been there for a couple years. They seem to like him. They're bringing him back, and all this receiving role stuff we're talking about. Like if Cook goes down, I don't think that all goes to Ray Davis. I do think Ty Johnson gets involved and is a meaningful piece. Maybe not totally draftable in like best ball, but I think in deep managed or just off the waiver wire in season, I do think Ty Johnson is relevant to the fantasy discussion this year.
Yeah, agree with that. Let's go to wide receiver, because this is the one where people have the most question marks. It's one of those rooms where people feel like there has to be a value somewhere. I'm typically not one of those drafters. Like we mentioned, there's some stuff with the pass rate. It could be different from last year. We got a lot of Josh Allen rush touchdowns. It's possible that no one here is like super important at ADP, but it's also possible that one of these guys really breaks away. The top three receivers we have in targets are Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel, Khalil Shakir. I think MVS will be fourth. Mac Hollins might annoyingly play more than I think people want looking at early camp stuff. I don't think in terms of like a target role as like sort of the wind sprinter, run blocker on the outside type thing. But let's talk about Keon, because he's super interesting to me. I've been maybe oversimplifying my argument on Keon. I'm a little bit higher on Keon than our ranking, and we've got him at 85 targets. Gretch has 72 targets. That nets to about 140 full PPR points for us, 117 for Gretch. We might be layering in some of the rookie upside into the base more than we actually think, because there's definitely a chance that he misses way low on this as a rookie receiver that the team's talked about is pretty raw. But just viewing him relative to the other rookies, he seems a little undervalued to me. Maybe not on DraftKings where he goes with them, but on the sites where he goes like a full round after Ladd McConkey. I just kind of feel like, he got drafted before Ladd, and I think he's in a better spot than Ladd, even though I know like the competition stuff for Ladd seems so good, but just like playing for the Bills offense with Josh Allen, with Stephon Diggs gone. So I don't know, I rambled a bit there, but I'm a little bit more bullish on Keon than the market relative to the other rookie receivers, ADPs.
I think that's all really good context. Some context for me is I'm just finishing up my projections after camp has started, and I think I would have projected Keon. I know I would have projected Keon higher if we hadn't heard a little bit of like pumping the brakes from the team in the first couple of days of camp. And so I wind up a little bit lower than you, but I think I would rather be high. I'm probably artificially driving him down based on just recent news, but I mean, that's sort of the concern, right? Is that he's a slow starter. Go ahead.
So I would just say two things there. One, I wanted to get your take on him just like analytically as a prospect, because I think that's where some people are concerned about him, is like taking away the draft capital landing spot. People just worried that he's not that good. But two, it did seem like in the mini camp stuff, there was a lot of pump the brakes talk. In early training camp, they played him at slot some, which is a good sign, because I know a lot of people worried he was just going to be an X and that would be bad for him. And it seems like he's done okay, pretty good the beginning of training camp. But mini camp stuff, they were definitely talking like, oh, he's a raw rookie, it's going to take him time, all those things. It was not super like, oh my God, he's going to come in and tear things up right away.
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting one. Like, one of the things that was tough in the draft process was his teammate Johnny Wilson didn't have as much production as him, but ran a lot fewer routes. And if you looked at like some of the per route stuff, he actually was significantly better than Keon Coleman at Florida State last year in terms of earning volume per route. But the raw numbers matter too. I think film people really like Keon Coleman's game. He was solid at earning volume early in his career at Michigan State, then transfers to Florida State, and it doesn't really grow or anything. It just sits in the same range of like 22 to 23%, which is fine at a high ADOT like he has, but is not like first round wide receiver. Like a lot of the really good wide receivers earn big volume, right? It pops off the page, at the college level. I'm not like out on him as a prospect profile. He was also, I should know, like not super efficient in yards per target. So the yards per run are like not good, not bad, but like not good. Like again, like the big name wide receiver prospects typically are. So you've probably heard a little bit of FUD. If you're listening to this podcast about his analytical profile, I'm not like totally out on it. And I'm with you. Like if he does hit, this opportunity is strong. Like you were comparing it to Ladd's opportunity. I mean, he can hit in a really meaningful way here. As we talk about like some of the other receivers, part of the reason I'm a little bit more bullish on Keon and I do draft him, even though this projection comes in a little light, is, MVS had a crazy low targets per out run last year. Matt Collins, you mentioned, is probably going to play. Those guys are probably going to take the Gabe Davis role and not earn a ton of volume. Khalil Shakir has been sub 14% targets per out run both years of his career. I do think that's going to come up a little bit this year as he's a little bit more featured in the progressions and stuff, but that's in a slot role, like a low A-dot role. He has not earned volume at the NFL level yet. People, I think, are they're out over their skis a little bit on what Shakir is based on some after the target efficiency on a small sample. He's been really good at yards per target and those things. Curtis Samuel, I think, is a good, not great volume earner. Fun stat on him, he's had between 90 and 105 targets 4 of the last 5 years across multiple teams. The only year he didn't do that, he was injured. It's like you can basically lock him in for 90 to 105 targets. Like I felt really comfortable putting him at, I think I put him at like 94 targets. I was like, yep, this is what I'm going to say Curtis Samuel does, because he seems to do it every single year. But that's not so much volume that it, stops Keon Coleman from becoming a true number one. Like you said, he's going to be used in some interesting ways. Probably he's going to be a little bit of a gadget guy at times. And yet he's not going to be a 130 target guy, I don't think, in this offense. He's going to be meaningful, and I do draft him some too. But Coleman's, I think, pretty clearly the guy who has the upside in this wide receiver room if he's a big hit. And sometimes the prospect profile doesn't tell the whole story. And again, his prospect profile to me is not so bad that like we should be completely out on him.
Yeah. I like that. And comparing again to Ladd, I do think there's a bit more volatility with Keon on both ends, which makes him a lower floor. There are ways the Bills can take him off the field. Ladd would probably have to be really bad to get taken off the field in that room. So I think from a floor target perspective, it's definitely a cleaner path for Ladd. From a ceiling target perspective, all the things you said, I think Keon's is probably under the radar, like just as strong. You mentioned, I don't have a big take on Curtis Samuel. Like sometimes when guys are like in these gadgety roles, I get a little concerned that he's not going to play as much pure wide receiver as we want, which to your point might just cap the ceiling on those targets. We're probably a little light on him at 80 targets compared to your 94. But we do have 24 rushing attempts for Curtis Samuel. I think he had 40 or something. He's been used by Joe Brady in the past in Carolina, I believe.
I only gave him 7, and I was just looking at that Joe Brady season. 41 rush attempts, 200 yards, 2 TDs, had 97 targets when he was a receiver for Joe Brady in 2020 in Carolina. He was 24 years old then, a little bit of a different situation, but I like your guys' rush attempt projection more than I only projected 7 rush attempts. I'm probably light.
Yeah, I will say as we talk through this, if everyone stays healthy, there is the potential for this to be very messy and annoying for everyone on this team. That's not Josh Allen.
That's Shakir, I think kind of the expectation, right?
Yeah. Someone's kind of got to emerge either talent wise or due to injury, I think. And again, that's why I don't think like someone's a must draft at ADP, despite it being a very good offense. But I do, still think there's upside for these guys. With Shakir, I've soured on him a little bit. His yards per target stuff, like he had an insane run of efficiency. Like he caught like 18 targets in a row or something like that. I'm a little concerned that he's one of those guys that it's just not going to translate to more volume. Like we do this a lot of times with like this lower volume efficiency. And we're like, oh, imagine when he gets more work. And then they just don't really get more work. We talked about Khalif Raymond a little bit for Detroit when we did that one. So, we both have him just shy of 70 targets.
Yeah. I mean, I think he's going to run more routes this year, but I think you said that really well. Like I'm projecting him as the most efficient receiver in this passing game, even at a little bit of a lower ADOT, like the highest yards per target of anyone in the passing game, because he's shown some ability to be efficient. But I think when you separate out the after the target efficiency from the target earning, even if his routes go up, like the target per route run stuff is alarming so far. And I think you have a hard time telling yourself a story that he's going to earn a ton of targets, right? Like enough that he's really paying off a price tag that's pretty high. And I know some people in best ball are just thinking of him in the round 11 range as like a spike week guy. But I mean, we both have him below 70 targets. That's not in the range where he's going. It's like, you should be able to see more volume.
Agreed. Bills beat writer Joe Buscaglia says MVS is a lock to make the team. That could be like a late round. If you were to take a late round guy with Josh Allen, it'd be him. I wouldn't take him under other circumstances. I don't think there's much target upside. Probably some big play spike week upside.
That's how I've been. I was going to ask you about Claypool. That's how I've been playing it with MVS. What do you know about Claypool?
I think Claypool is a dog to make the team. Especially he's already banged up in camp, and I think it was already a little bit of an uphill battle. I want to rule it out completely. Claypool, you can tell yourself a little bit more of a story of like this, something weird happens and he has this upside that MVS doesn't. But I think MVS is, way more likely to play ahead of him and be on the team. Just there's some special teams guys and some other guys in the mix with Claypool kind of battling. Like Matt Collins, they said, is basically a lock to make the team too. So you're down to like 2 spots at this point, and it's not as I think the casuals here, Claypool kind of assume he's going to make the team. I think it's more of a tryout.
I think that's exactly how I'd put it, including the Claypool probably has a little bit more upside, but I haven't been able to pull the trigger because I think he's a dog to make the team too. I think the MVS and Hollins guys, I'm glad we're on the same page on that. They do the things that coaches want. They're going to stretch the field vertically, run good, win sprints, block on run plays. Claypool seems to have like upset most of the coaching staffs he's worked under in the last couple of years. Doesn't seem like the kind of guy that's going to beat, those types of stable veterans out necessarily. But I do agree with you. If he made the team, like there's a little bit more intrigue to his profile, but it's just, seems like a dog.
At tight end, we're pretty similar. You've got Kincaid for 122 targets and Knox for 50. We've got Kincaid for 111 and Knox for 47. You're building in a little bit more yards per catch efficiency upside on Kincaid in year 2, it looks like, but pretty similar, especially when you get to the tight end premium scoring. You've got him at 257. We've got him at 234. I know you're pretty in on Kincaid, so I'll throw it to you on him.
Yeah, I've been taking him over Andrews all offseason and been asked that by a lot of people who talk about Andrews. And I do want to kind of talk about them in conjunction, because we talked about Andrews on the last pod, because Andrews is a very efficient player and has been throughout his career. And Kincaid, the conversation on him is that we don't know if he's really good or he wasn't very good last year. And I mean, I would start by emphasizing that he had a better rookie season than he gets credit for by every measure, in my opinion. He had a finish with a 19.6% targets per out run. At tight end, if you get up over 20%, you get to 21, 22%. That's really good for even high-end tight ends. You don't see as many tight ends in the 25% range. To start as a rookie at a position we know is slow developing and get close to 20%, multiple percentage points above any year of Dawson Knox's career in this offense is meaningful. And people talk about how a lot of the volume was at a low ADOT. His ADOT actually finished at 6.7. The league average for tight end around 7.5, 7.6. Pretty close to league average, despite the fact that early on it was very, very low. And people remember the first few weeks of the season. But again, this is the spot where I would talk about the coordinator switch the most. The first 10 weeks under Ken Dorsey, 4.2 ADOT. From week 11 through the playoffs, a 9.4 ADOT. That's above average for a tight end. His yards per out run didn't necessarily smash down the stretch, but his targets per out run also slightly rose in the later sample with the higher ADOT. And the efficiency on the whole season was good. I've talked about depth adjusted efficiency before. And I talked about with Andrews on our last show how his ADOT actually came down last year in the Todd Monken offense to 8.2. Very different role in the slot, a lot more than he ever had been the rest of his career. Andrews has always had these high yards per target, but it's been depth adjusted. It's still been good depth adjusted, but it's been relative to high ADOTs. And so I do think it's notable to point out that last year Andrews was down at 8.2, and Kincaid, after the coordinator switch, was actually higher in ADOT. And then for Kincaid for the season, his depth adjusted racer, which is the efficiency metric I use in my projections, was plus 0.12. That would be in Andrews' 6 seasons, dead in the middle. It would be better than his 3 worst seasons and worse than his 3 best seasons in terms of depth adjustments. Again, Andrews has typically had the higher ADOTs, but because Andrews has consistently had these yards per targets up over 8, his yards per route run, which yards per target impacts, have been consistently a lot higher than the 1.46 that Kincaid put out last year. But again, I just have to stress with Kincaid, the targets per route run was strong enough. The yards per target was good relative to his depth of target. It improved under the new coordinator. If you think of these guys as actually running at similar ADOTs and also being relatively similar bets in depth adjusted efficiency, then the conversation becomes, who's going to earn more targets this year, right? And those are some assumptions on Kincaid, I'll grant. But in the Andrews episode, I talked about how this offense doesn't feel like it's really focused on Andrews anymore. The Todd Monken offense, the past Greg Roman offense is very tight end focused. I don't know that this is like the season where I'm like, we're going to get the Mark Andrews best season of his career when I go through and look at the numbers in the Baltimore offense. The Kincaid offense, we just talked about Keon Coleman having some question marks in his profile and the rest of the receivers not necessarily being big volume earners. I'm not a big vacated targets guy, but Stephon Diggs, 160 targets gone. Gabe Davis, 81 targets gone. Kincaid had 91 last year. No other wide receiver or tight end had more than 45 in this offense. Shakir had 45. Dawson Knox had 36. And then you go down to Trent Sherfield had 22. And that's, removing the running backs. But they basically let their top 2 target earners with 240 targets go and replaced him with Curtis Samuel and Keon Coleman. To me, the other guy who had big volume last year, 91 targets, Dalton Kincaid, that's a huge point to say we're going to run more of the offense through that guy who was a big part of the offense last year and was focused on more after the coordinator switch. This is the season. If you go 10 years in the future and we look back and Dalton Kincaid was a good tight end, this is the breakout season. Year 2 is the year where he went off, right? Like, I don't know for sure that we're going to be 10 years from now looking back and Dalton Kincaid was a great player, but I do think he gets too much of a bad rap for that rookie year. He was a little bit of an older prospect. The prospect profile is not perfect. I understand all that, but a first round draft capital player, the rookie year was not bad. It wasn't great, but it wasn't bad.
Especially at tight end position. I mean, we quite often see like someone like Trey McBride, like it can take a year. McBride was awful his first year, so you definitely don't want to overreact to that.
I think he has some of the most upside at the position. It's just where I was going to cap that. If he actually does have the higher ADOT and is able to stay efficient on it, and the volume could really flow through him, it wouldn't be surprising to me if he got 120 or 130 targets, which is massive at tight end. I mean, this is a guy who could actually run away from the position, and people are acting like he's bad and doesn't even belong in a conversation with Mark Andrews. So I just wanted to emphasize, I don't think that's a fair look at, especially after the coordinator change, how he was used and how Andrews was used last year, which again, I still think Andrews is good and I still draft, but they're not that different in terms of how I expect them to play in 2024.
Yeah, especially if you start getting the FFPC tight end premium, where I think you do probably get more catch volume out of Kincaid. I know some people look at the Knox Kincaid stuff. I do think Knox is still going to play some. I think he's a last round best ball guy if you've got Josh Allen, maybe if you're absolutely desperate with having some contingent upside. But to your point about the upside on Kincaid, I do think it's like, if he runs 70 to 75% of the routes with Knox in, that's not ideal, but it's fine. Mm-hmm. And there's some chance, either due to a Knox injury or just a change in philosophy, that he's up to 90%. And, he was getting 90% routes in the games that Knox did not play last year, and he still stayed around 70 to 75-ish after Knox came back.
And I mean, he plays a lot in the slot. I just wound up projecting, because we both have Knox around 50 targets. I actually have slightly more than you guys, even though I'm higher on the Kincaid targets. I just wound up projecting this team's tight end target share to balloon, because the wide receivers aren't big volume earners. And I just think they'll probably play a lot together, like you were kind of saying.
Yeah.
That's another note against Shakir, by the way, because he plays a lot out of the slot, and so does Kincaid. If they're playing 2 tight end sets and Knox is playing traditional tight end and Kincaid's in the slot, it's not great news for Shakir.
There could definitely be, I think they're going to use a lot of different formations this year, which, might be good for the offense as a whole, but for the individual pieces, makes it tougher to hit a ceiling on the depth wide receivers. Let's go to New England. Again, we're like spot on in play calling, around 61.5 plays per game, 59% called pass rate, which is going to be, negative PROE. They're not expected to be that good, but with, rookie quarterback expected to play at some point, you just tend to have a little bit more conservative play calling, and that funnels down to the plays per game for New England. Anything on the overarching play calling for you on them?
No, I think, Alex Van Pelt's the new offensive coordinator. He's been with the Browns and he's played with some tempo, but also been very run heavy. And, the team's expected to be bad. It forces a little bit of a higher pass rate probably than he might prefer to play with, but it also probably keeps the plays down, which is, what we're both projecting.
As far as Drake May goes, we're projecting him to play more games than Gretch right now, but that's so that the actual projection I think is not super important. The things that are important is, what's his upside when he does play and what are the odds he plays. We were looking, I should have brought the New England schedule up. I know they have a tough schedule out of the gate, and Thorman and company, let me just pull it up real quick. So they've got Cincinnati, Seattle, then they have games against Jets, San Francisco, Miami, Houston. So it's definitely a tough stretch, those first 6 games. Our thought process is that maybe they're protecting him a little bit, and it's going to be tough for those to go well for Jacoby Brissett, even if he starts the year. So we think there's pretty good odds that May's playing about 2/3 of the season or so.
Really mixed messaging from the team on this, in my opinion. Right after they drafted him, they talked about how the team's not ready for him to play. They basically were talking like they don't want to break him, like this idea of you can push a rookie QB out there too early, which a lot of people dispute, but they seem to believe when they were talking through it. Their roster's not good enough. They don't want to just put him out there. But then to start camp, he's getting half of the first team reps, right? So it really has been sort of unclear, I think. I think he's clearly the bigger talent than Brissett, but Brissett is this veteran that can do the things that you need him to do, the little things. He'll probably take sacks at a much lower rate than Drake May, and potentially turn the ball over at a lower rate. Like Drake May, one of the exciting things about him for fantasy is he's actually got more mobility than I think people give him credit for, and he's willing to push the ball downfield. But that's also going to lead to some interceptions when you're playing your first games at the NFL level and you're seeing the ways that they disguise coverages pre-snap and start rolling safeties after the snap and all that kind of stuff. He's going to throw into some picks. I'm not sure how to project the playing time. I think it's possible that they hold him back. I think it's possible that after they play him, he throws some picks, takes some sacks, and they go back to Brissett at times, right? Like, I'm a little bit worried about how much he actually – that would not be great. But I do think down the stretch, Drake May is going to be the quarterback of this team, right? Like the second half of the year. They need to know what they have in him and that kind of stuff. So I'm projecting a 60-40 playing time split. Like I do it in my projections based on dropback share. I have Drake May at 60% of the dropbacks. But I'm not like – I'm probably low. I may be being a little too bearish.
There is a comedian on Twitter, Joey Molinaro, that's worth checking out. He did a funny skit on like the team press conferences by month with a rookie quarterback. The way you were saying they were talking about him just reminded, it was like verbatim, like what they say in June, and then like how it slowly changes July, and then before you know it, he's named the starter. But
right. He might play the whole year.
Yeah, I've been taking May in best ball as I'm not going into drafts thinking like I want to get a lot of Drake May. He's been kind of like, he's my first go-to for the backdoor stacks, I guess, late. Just because I think there's some rushing upside. And then just a combination of rookie quarterback, rookie receivers. There's just some way this breaks right for a few guys. And just the price tags make it easy to stack. Like there's tons of options, which we'll talk about, but you got Demario Douglas, the rookies in Polk and Javon Baker. It's very easy to see. Antonio Gibson as a running back, that pass catch is just very easy to do late, but I haven't been like prioritizing him, I guess, is the way I see it. For redraft leagues, one thing I've done more in the past few years that I used to not do is take multiple quarterbacks. I'm just curious if May is someone you would take as QB2 very late in redraft leagues, assuming a bigger bench size.
Yeah, deep enough league for sure. I think the upside is there. In shallower formats, you're just waiting to see when he starts.
Yeah, not a home league, but I guess the FFPC, NFC high stakes where you got like 10 bench spots.
For sure. Yeah, I think he's a great QB2 in those formats where, especially if you have a QB1, you're comfortable playing in the first however long until that quarterback's bye, basically. You're like, okay, well, I mean, Drake May's this upside QB2 that I can stash and see what happens. You might have to cut him as well. I mean, he's going to be someone I think will be played off the waiver wire in a lot of leagues this year. But at the same time, like, I don't mind. as far as that like FFPC high stake stuff, I wouldn't mind picking him up in advance of him starting and stashing him, right? Like week 3 or something, somebody already cuts him and you're like, okay, well, I only drafted one quarterback. I'll grab Drake May and hold him as my QB2. I mean, I think that's another way to play it. So I think it'll be, I mean, he might start week 1. That's a good argument for actually drafting him to secure him. But I think he's worth holding even when he's not starting, because the profile does have upside, as you were talking through. I've had a harder time with it in best ball. Like I tend to lean towards the guys that I think are going to play more games. Like I think Bo Nix is going to play more. And so I'm like, my preferred is probably Nix, but I do take some May. But it'll be
a little bit better. Just I guess lean on some like draft capital stuff and whatnot. But it'll
be interesting to talk to the rest of the team, as you're somebody who's been seeing the upside. I'm someone who's been like too cautious and not drafting them. So we have different approaches in how we've been playing it.
Yeah. And how you've constructed your roster to that point obviously matters a lot too. At the running back spot, we're a little bit more bullish on Gibson. Gretch has Ramondre at 237 carries to 78 for Gibson. We're at 209 to 128. So a little bit tighter split there. Targets were both pretty similar. Ramondre around 50, Gibson around 40. This for us has Ramondre as like, in most formats, a fade. There's obviously circumstances in best ball where we'll take almost anybody, but for most formats, a fade, and Gibson as a target for us. I do like Gibson better in best ball than redraft, just because I think it's more of like, I think you're getting more usable weeks out of Gibson than a lot of running backs that go with them, but I don't know if you're necessarily capturing a large amount of upside.
I mean, I think the story we always told ourselves with Gibson is he's a big, fast, athletic back. Didn't play a lot of running back in college. Maybe he could develop those traits. And I could still see where like the handcuff value here could be that he saw his targets actually scale up each year in Washington: 44, 52, 58, 59. Those are his target numbers each of his 4 years at Washington. So he continued to play in the pass game throughout, but they basically completely gave up on him as a runner. He had 170 carries as a rookie, 258 in year 2, which is like a real workload, 149 the next year, and then only 65 last year in conjunction with that career high 59 targets. He was basically, only a receiving back last year. And that's part of, I think, what I'm playing into with my base projection here, where, I mean, Gibson to me, based on last year, looks like mostly just a passing down back, but based on the profile and based on that 258 carries in year 2, like certainly if New England thinks they can tap into something as a rusher that Washington was just wrong on, and if there's a team that, I would believe could just be completely wrong on something like that, Washington would probably be up there, right? So, I mean, like you could see the upside for Gibson. I've definitely taken him some. I think he's going to have some standalone value. And then, probably the handcuff, right? But I just don't know that he would get the rushing work for sure if Ramondre was out.
Yeah, that's a good point. It looks like Kevin Harris is going to be the RB3 there. We previously just had that going unlisted, so we'll update that, but not going to change our volume stuff on Ramondre and Gibson. I don't think that's a ton of, competition for these guys. Is part of the reason why, like, volume wise, you can get them into a draftable spot, but it's tough. You just running backs on bad teams are tough bets, especially if they're going to split time a little bit.
And JaMychal Hasty's there, probably plays a little like an additional passing down player, but I think plays a little bit on special teams. And I think Harris plays on special teams as well. Maybe Hasty won't make the team. I don't know. But I am a little bit – I think I'm more uncertain about how all of the usage is going to split out for New England than most people are. But Ramondre, to me, is the one, especially after this contract, that is probably going to see good volume.
Yeah, if you're worried that the RB3 cuts in more than we have it, then you can see where the Gibson value could disappear, a bit more quickly. It's definitely tough when you get in that range of running backs. Let's go to the receivers, and we both have Jalen Polk for around 73 targets. The guy we're most different on, and I feel like we're probably too conservative when we were just trying too hard to lean into the rookies, but we have Demario Douglas for 68 targets. You have him for 83. So maybe let's actually start there before going to the rookies, because he was obviously a pretty good target earner when they didn't have much down the stretch last season.
Yeah, 23% targets per out run right out of the gate as a rookie. Yeah, it was low 8-out stuff. Yeah, he didn't score a touchdown the whole season, but was reasonably efficient for the low 8-out. 1.7 yards per out run is solid. It's mostly just like I could see him in this slot role with more certainty in the role than the rest of the offense. This is a really hard one to project out. And what I came to ultimately is like, even if I'm getting the May side of it right with some of these backdoor stacks, I think it's a kind of a tough double parlay to get May right, the playing time right, and he's good and all of that, and get wide receiver right, because Kendrick Bourne signed a meaningful contract to come back to this team. They signed KJ Osborne in free agency to a smaller contract, but could factor in the early camp news. If I was like, I think it's going to be fluid, but if I was drafting this week, New England, I would not be drafting Javon Baker at all, because the early camp news is that he's going to have a really hard time cracking the top 4. And it's because he's behind veterans like Bourne and Osborne. You have Douglas there, and then you have Jalen Polk, who is immediately looking like a day 1 starter and is the guy getting drafted the highest, but he goes pretty high as well.
He does, especially for a team that we don't expect to be very good. So I'm with you that it's tough. I guess when I'm stuck in backdoor stacks, I'm kind of willing to take that risk on where like I'd rather have to take this tough bet, but know I have the correlation than lose my correlation. But as far as redraft goes, it's more just, I don't think I'm drafting Douglas or Bourne or those guys. It's kind of like, do I want to take shots on Baker or Polk? And to your point, Ben, I've generally on non-May teams found other rookie wide receivers I'd rather take shots on. I talked about how I really like Jalen McMillan. Like that's someone I generally take ahead of Javon Baker. ADP is now in line with that, but it's still a decision at points. And I don't get as much Polk as I'd like because of the price.
It's
right
such
now.
a cleaner. Yeah, I'm not getting as much Polk as I'd like either because of the price. It's such a cleaner bet on McMillan where you're like, if he's good, he's the 3rd receiver. He's playing. Like Baker could be good and still be mired in a 5-man rotation because there's multiple veterans here that they signed this offseason and like, and it's just a tricky bet and path. And yeah, I think you said that well. I don't know that I'll be targeting them a lot in managed. You talked through, thoughtfully getting the correlation in best ball. I do like, and I think that's how most people are playing it, is understanding that. But I do see some people that are like, yeah, we can just take May because he's so easy to backstack. And I'm like, yeah, there's names back there, but they belong back there. Like it's not actually easy to get that backstack right. It might feel good when you click the New England debate, but it's like we don't actually know if that guy's going to matter meaningfully. It could just be KJ Osborne who winds up with the most targets or something. He's the guy that I would probably put the lowest on the list. Like he's probably not quite as good as Kendrick Bourne in my opinion, but it's a mess, man. If Douglas gets meaningful stuff out of the slot, Polk is the clear, like they're talking him up at camp. He's playing with the first team right away. He's the highest draft capital guy. He's the upside swing for sure. But his ADP tends to reflect that. I think for some people, it's maybe still too low. Our buddy Pat Kerrane, I know, was very high on Jalen Polk and thinks he should be even higher, which is maybe, the case. He went to UW where I went. I loved watching Jalen Polk in college, but also when you dig into the numbers, doesn't earn volume in a massive way. A couple late season games last year stick with me where UW really needed to win close games at Oregon State and at home against Washington State. They both won them by 1 score late. Polk went catchless in both games. He just like disappeared. He had a couple drops, which I mean, look, that's like very anecdotal, but he was a key part of our passing game. And as like a fan, you're like, man, like didn't come up big in the moment when we needed him to. And that is reflected in like some of his targets per out run data and stuff where he's good, but not great at that. He's a fun receiver, high ADOT guy, wins at the catch point, wins after the catch, physical. He's that mold of big downfield guy that is like fun to watch, but like, can the pure volume ceiling match what I think people want it to? And especially with this many players in the passing game, that's where I struggle with Polk.
At tight end, Hunter Henry pretty clearly the T1 here. You have him for 67 targets. We're at 60. And then you've got, Austin Hooper T2, Jaheim Bell, the rookie, T3, who neither of us are expecting to play that much year one. Even with a clear runway for Henry, I don't have much of him early on. It's a spot where I'm generally not drafting a lot of tight end. And I think the ones that go later, like just as fine as him. But do you have any thoughts contrary to that?
Nope. I think throw him into the mix of all this confusion about targets that we talked about. We both have him for between 60 and 70 targets. He just adds to the problem. He also has less upside because of the problem. It's tricky.
Let's go to Miami. Again, we're really in line with play calling on these AFC East teams. We both have them around 62.5 plays per game. They are a little bit slower paced. We have them at a called pass rate at 60% because they lose. Sometimes they lose plays on drives because they're so efficient. But they do that pre-snap motion sometimes. It just takes longer to snap the ball, and kind of like with some similarities to San Francisco, where their run rates like higher than you think for a very good offense. And it's just tough to get in a huge amount of play volume, but they do tend to make that up with a heck of a lot of efficiency.
Yeah, it's almost like all their passes are such explosive plays that then they're running on other plays, right? Like they don't get to throw enough as a result. It's one of those things where we always talk about this with the efficient offenses. If you're doing a projection and you get to Miami or San Francisco, the biggest mistake that I see people make is they regress the efficiency because it's through the roof, and you're like, I can't. This offense can't be this efficient again. It's crazy. They regress the efficiency, but then they don't bump the play volume or the pass rate a little bit or those things. Like when the team is super efficient, they're scoring points and they're getting out ahead early in games, and it's causing their expected pass rate to plummet. And additionally, when they're very efficient, they're not running a lot of plays per drive, but they're still scoring. There's a difference on plays per drive being we scored on 5 plays and we had 5 plays and we had to punt. And, it's a very different scenario. And with Miami, when it's a really good thing that they're running so hot in efficiency that they're keeping their play volume down, you don't want to like regress out all the efficiency. Like we'll talk with Devon Achane. He had 7.8 yards per carry last year. You can't project that. But like if I'm projecting him to not average 7.8 yards per carry, then they're going to have to run more plays, right? Like that's just the way it changes things. So it's a tricky balance with a team like this in San Francisco as well, as you noted.
Yeah, and I do like Tua a little bit better in best ball. Very rarely do I have like a better in best ball quarterback, but I feel like Tua just the way their touchdown distribution could work. Like he could have some games where they, Mostert and Achane run for like 4 touchdowns, but some games where he throws for like 4 touchdowns too. And like obviously pretty stackable with Waddle, Tyreek in the beginning parts of drafts. You've got him at 312 fantasy points over the course of the season. We're at 297. So pretty similar there. We have 1 more rushing touchdown. You have a couple more passing touchdowns, and it more or less cancels out.
Yeah, I don't know why my rush TD rate on him is so low. I got it crazy low. But yeah, I just see maybe the concussion stuff. I was thinking when I did this that they were, kind of protect him or something. But I see him the way that you said. He's going to be efficient. This is going to be an efficient offense. He's going to be involved in some of the touchdowns, but there is going to be a meaningful number of running back touchdowns. I think that's the big lesson we learned last year. The top 2 running backs combined for 32 touchdowns. That's a really, really high rate. Raheem Mostert led the NFL with 21, and Achane still had double digit with 11 of his own. Like that's, if you have double digit TDs behind the league leader in TDs at the same position, your team's scoring a lot of running back touchdowns. So that I think, and the lack of rushing somewhat caps Tua's upside. At the same time, the massive efficiency from his receivers, Tyreek and Waddle are going to give him a nice floor and some weekly spikes for sure.
Yeah, I'm just making a note to our team to double check the running back touchdowns as we're talking through it. And looking ahead to Mostert, who you've got 175 carries, we've got 155. In terms of total touchdowns, you've got him between like 9.5. We've got him more like 7.5. I think we're probably light. Again, it's just very hard to get that correct. Part of that stems from the volume, which we'll talk about Jalen Wright in a second, and just the third back for Miami, how much that factors in. Achane, we're pretty close on volume. You've got a bit more juice in the passing game, though. We're at 58 targets. You're at 70. The rush stuff, we're very similar, especially after accounting for some of the projection bias stuff. So our stuff has been pretty like, hey, Achane at the 2-3 turn, especially if he ever falls to mid-3, like that's a good pick. We've been behind on Mostert, and I wonder if, early on we fudged some stuff to right because it was like, oh, rookie back, explosive, such a great landing spot for Miami. Now that the hype's died down, I wonder if we maybe overly put that in. So just curious your thoughts on how Wright factors in and just the running back room in general.
I think I'm thinking of Wright as the most valuable handcuff in fantasy, more or less.
Okay,
Him or Blake Corum, who we talked through very favorably in the NFC West episode. But I think because of what we just talked about for the total value in this backfield, could meaningfully jump in value. And what's fascinating to me is Mostert led the NFL in touchdowns with 21 last year, as I just said, and is going in the 8th round in some of these underdog drafts so far, probably a little higher in home leagues. But that's never happened in fantasy football history. I'm confident that the guy who led the NFL in touchdowns the year prior is going
I was
the
thinking about
first 5 rounds.
Yeah.
There's just no way. And I mean, I think that clearly says that the market is predicting that Mostert can't play 17 games again because he's 32 years old. But it is fascinating that he entered last year with 19 career touchdowns and he exited with 40. He had more touchdowns last season than he did in his entire career up to that point. We talked before about how peaks for players are not the most like predictable, and they're not always the same type of peak. And for me, when you get to an age 32 back who has shown some efficiency decline and you're hoping he's the same guy he was at 25, that's the problem. When he was the best he's ever been at 31, it's a different conversation about a 32-year-old back is what I'll say. Like, this is his peak. There's no question that last year was Raheem Mostert's peak season. It was his best season of his career. He's had some other good seasons that have come late in his 20s in this recent range. This is the extended Raheem Mostert peak. I think he's one of the best values on the board because you're really just saying if he's healthy. I mean, I think Achane probably takes some from Mostert, but if he's healthy and just does anything close to what he did last year, he's a smash at his ADP. If he's not healthy, then Jalen Wright is probably factoring in, and he's been getting some camp buzz because Achane had to go on IR last year. He's a smaller back. He does have some workhorse credentials from college, but I don't know that they're going to want to give him a massive workhorse role. I love Achane. I'm in on Achane. We've talked also about you don't regress at all efficiency out of players like this, that league-winning players are going to have outlierish efficiency. So an Achane projection is tough because you do regress the efficiency some, but you also note like this is the type of dude that can do outlierish efficiency stuff. The target volume you mentioned, he averaged over 4 targets per game in the final 6 games. He had 6 in their playoff game. And the running back target rate for Miami notably spiked last year with him added. It had been lower in prior seasons. They'd also included their fullback in the passing game a little bit more. Alec Ingold, I think he was pushed a little bit aside, but he still gets a few targets. But basically, Achane looked like a running back that they were throwing to with intent out of the backfield at times, and different than they had even with Mostert. So that's part of the upside case with Achane would be that he could actually have a real strong receiving role. He could have the huge efficiency. I'm in on Achane at his cost as an outlier, hyper efficient, like Chris Johnson, Jamal Charles type. This is what the legendary upside season looks like for him. I'm in at Raheem Mostert at cost because it's like this guy scored 20 plus touchdowns last year and the backfield scored over 30. They trust him. I don't think he's going to give up work. They think they're going to ride him until he gets hurt, right? I think they think he's the lead back. And then Jalen Wright I'm in on as this guy that if either Achane or Mostert, who both have injury issues in their past, misses time, he's probably stepping into a backfield where Jeff Wilson averaged. He's a guy who's no one's talking about. He averaged 4.6 yards per carry last year, 4.7 the year before. Every back is hyper efficient in this offense is the point about Wilson. Not that Wilson is a guy to target. If Jalen Wright gets an opportunity in this offense, and again, making the camp buzz early is positive, I think he has meaningful weekly spike potential as well, even if he's splitting with Mostert or splitting with Achane when the other one has missed some time. So this is a backfield I really want to target at all 3 levels of the draft.
Yeah, I think we're likely to come up some on Mostert after this. I think we're just like slightly double counting against him by being a little conservative on his volume to age, but then also maybe overly regressing some of the efficiency stuff. So I think we're likely to come up on Mostert from where we are right now. Let's go to the receiver position. Tyreek Hill, you've got this very concentrated. We've got it pretty concentrated, but you've got it even more so. You've got Tyreek at 176 targets. We're at 148. We've got Waddle at 107 targets. You're at 129. We are building in some in our ceiling cases, kind of like if one of the guys gets hurt or not, a little bit more volume upside there. Curious where you're taking Tyreek, given that, like with our projection, we've got him pretty firmly third, like definitely ahead of Chase and Jefferson, but behind Lamb. Do you take Lamb first or Tyreek first?
I initially was taking Tyreek first. like in the early off season, because I was looking at the per route run type stuff, and he has absolutely dominated the rest of the NFL in that. He had a target on 35% of routes run last year. The next best wide receiver was at 29%. And if you get to 30%, that's really good. He was at 35%. And that was at a high ADOT. So I have this weighted targets per route run stat. His weighted targets per route run is 0.92 after, the way that I scale it. The next best receiver in the NFL was 0.76. So there's like this huge gap. There's two guys at 0.76, 0.74, 0.72. The next best receivers are all in this 0.7 range. He's at 0.92. I mean, just way above. The reason I'm actually back to Lamb is there was a huge actual routes run gap between Tyreek and Lamb last year. And my Stealing Bananas co-host, Sean Siegel, pointed out he kind of expected that to occur again. And as I looked through this projection, I felt that way as well. They don't usually run Tyreek like 95% of the dropbacks route rates, and they also throw the ball less, whereas Lamb's out there on every single dropback running a route, and they throw the ball more, right? So he's actually probably going to run 100 more routes than Tyreek Hill and earn volume at a really high clip per route. But Tyreek's number is really, really high. And for me, those two are in a tier basically above all the other receivers. And I think those are the two that really have this conversation for, flirting with 200 targets this year and having these monster, flirting with 2,000 receiving yards and doing these monster, statistical things. And then, as you noted, I'm also really concentrated on the Waddle volume. And that's because even though Tyreek was the 35% targets per out run guy, Waddle was 27%. He was right there in the top 10 as well. You look at weighted targets per out run, he was 11th in the NFL. In an offense where Tyreek Hill was running away from the rest of the league in this stat, Jalen Waddle was better than more than half of the league's other wide receiver ones in this same stat per route run stuff. There's a few elite wide receiver ones that are above him, but that just tells you that even as a number two, this guy gets so much volume. This is a really unique offense that Mike McDaniel is able to get the ball to the players that are the most impactful. And I understand that, yes, they've added some pieces. They added Odell Beckham. They added Jonnu. There's probably some likely, some possibility that it's a little bit more spread out this year. But I also think, the fact that defenses have not been able to dispel him from getting the ball to his best players at such a high rate is a good sign for fantasy, right? I'm comfortable projecting these guys this concentrated because we've seen it now for a couple of years that they're really going to go. Everything is going to flow through these two guys in the passing game. And then for Waddle, it's the contingent upside additionally. Like when Tyreek missed last year, he had a 140-yard game. If Tyreek misses for extended time, I was just talking through, he's already top 10, top 12 in these, per route run volume stats. If Tyreek's not in the offense, I mean, he's immediately projecting for top 5 in that stat, potentially 1, right? Like Waddle's now right there with the volume and the massive ceiling. So, love both those guys.
Yeah, and our Waddle line has him slightly behind in positional ADP, but this is where I like to make a note, especially with these second-round wide receivers. I mean, if we move something like 0.5% target share, guys are shifting around. So, I'm taking Waddle at ADP for the upside reasons that Ben mentioned. Even though our rank's slightly behind, it's tough to massage these ranks and get them 100% perfect when you're pulling them from the projections. But I do think it's worth pointing out that there are pockets where stuff's really sensitive to small changes in projection. We both have Odell Beckham for nearly 50 targets. I've taken him stacked round 18. I've taken him more than Malik Washington. Curious, who you would take between those two. If you're round 18, you need a receiver. You've got Tua. You want to stack. Which one are you taking?
I would probably take Beckham and defer that way. I don't take Tua unless I have Tyreek or Waddle already on the roster. So I'm typically not looking to. I mean, essentially, I think this team is so good at getting the ball to its players that even if there's an injury, that it would be more passing to Achane and more to Waddle if Tyreek's out, right? I think the other guys could bubble up a little. But this is more stats about this team. The third most receiving yards last year was only 366 across the team at any position. In 2022, it was 417. Typically, teams have at least 3 receivers hitting 500 receiving yards. Third most targets, 43. In 2022, it was 52. And I do have Devon Achane rising as sort of this third receiving weapon. Also, Jonnu Smith, who people are into, and we'll talk about in a minute. His 70 targets and 582 yards last year were career highs, which you can look at as bullish, but you can also talk about how in the past he had never done anything like he did with Atlanta. He didn't do it in New England when he got a big contract. And even though he was fun at times with the Titans early in his career, never had 70 targets in a season or even 582 yards. So him, Odell, Malik Washington, I'm like, I think I see them all having something of a role throughout the season, but that also the third best guy in this passing game is typically so low in volume. It's hard for me to see where one of them gets enough of a ceiling to pay off, even if they're just a late round pick.
Yeah, I feel somewhat similar to them and like Philly, who we'll talk about in the last episode, where like I don't know if there's a lot of as much contingent upside as you might think, given the way the offense operates.
Right.
And so essentially you're looking for like, I'm getting a spike week, like at the right time. I've done it more with Miami than Philly. I do think I'm somewhat, Odell did have this like downfield role with Baltimore where like it was like purely downfield and he seemed to still be able to get open on those plays. So that gives me a little bit of hope that like, hey, maybe we do get like 3 of those spike weeks over the course of the season. Sure. That pays off in best ball. I take him more than Malik. I've taken some Malik just on like fast rookie on Miami, like whatever, but not a lot. And only with Miami stuff and going to tight end. I've also only taken Jonnu on Miami stuff. He's gained some steam lately, but I'm just worried the volume's not going to be there for him. It seems like you are too. You got him for 47 targets. We've got him at 53. Even though this is an offense where someone with the athleticism of Jonnu can mix with the efficiency of this offense and have some pretty hyper efficient numbers, I don't know. It's tough. It's tough for me to take that, last round pick, fine, but he's going, a couple rounds before the last round at this point.
I think he's going to have some play designs for him and some cool stuff cooked up for him. But yeah, the thing that we end up talking about a lot is what's the actual target ceiling? What's can he earn consistent volume other than just having some fun play designs and stuff? I think they'll give Jonnu some carries probably in this offense. Like I think he's going to do some cool stuff. And same thing with Malik Washington. I could totally see that, but I think he's a 6th round pick, right? Like they just took Eric Ezunkama, who I liked a couple years ago in the 4th round. And that guy, he's been banged up, but like has barely played for them. It's really hard to crack this rotation when you have this good of players and they're so good at concentrating volume. I think Malik Washington probably does to some degree. And I think Jonnu Smith probably does to some degree. But again, the big question is like, can they get to 70 or 80 targets? Because you need that to really be. I mean, I think your point about Odell is with the high ADOT is a meaningful one. Like a couple spike weeks, and especially if you get one in the playoffs in best ball can really help. But as far as like home leagues and stuff, you need to see a consistent target rule for any of these guys. It's so hard. I mean, it's just not an offense that I like to backstack at the end.
Yeah, home leagues definitely out on all these guys. Let's go to the Jets. Plays per game pace, we're identical. We're at 62.4 plays per game. Both Gretch and I, a little bit different in called pass rate. We're at 61%. Gretch is at 59.5%. We might come down a little there. It's tough to say without really seeing what they did with Rodgers. There's part of me that's like with a better quarterback, they'll throw more, but this team also has one of the better rosters in the NFL. Don't let Levitan hear me say that because we have a Bills versus Jets bet ongoing this season, but that just could keep the expected pass rate low, and we're not expecting this to be a team that's going to be, plus PROE really. So if they're neutral PROE and then they end up with a low expected pass rate, that's where our number could be a little bit high here. I was trying to lean somewhat into like, hey, better quarterback situation, but it's tough.
I have this note and I copied a lot of it over from last year because like in a lot of ways, it's like, we didn't see the Rodgers bet last year at all. Like, are you just going to run that back or what are you thinking? I think I would have mentioned this on last year's AFC East show, but I wrote that the pass rate's tough, but I think there's some Brady and Tampa Bay potential where it's almost stat padding to put up a big season, like late in the year, like Rodgers wants to make a point kind of a thing. But then I also wrote, I'd otherwise project this as run leading based on the Jets' tendencies, a defensive head coach, Rodgers' recent offenses, and Breece Hall's talent. All of those things kind of push you towards a little bit more run lean. And yet that's what I'm projecting is a neutral pass rate, a slightly positive pass rate relative to their Vegas win total and the expected pass rate stuff that I have for 2024. You guys are a little more bullish on that, which I actually like. Like, I'm basically saying I want to project them to be even more pass heavy because I do see that as a possibility, right? Like, I think Rodgers is going to dictate. They've clearly said, like, Rodgers is their dude. Like, they're going to let him do whatever he wants. They didn't even add a quarterback all last season. They're like, well, we'll just pack it in for 2023. We have this great young defense, but we're going to give up on this season and we'll just go for 2024 because we don't want to make Aaron Rodgers mad. Like, have another quarterback come in and be good, and then there's a quarterback question in the offseason. Can't do that. So they are very in on letting Aaron Rodgers do what Aaron Rodgers wants to do. I think he's going to try to throw 40 touchdowns this year to make a point. But yeah, I mean, it's tough to see anything in the data, especially the 2023 data for the Jets, right? Like, they were a wild offense.
I do think the range on that pass rate's probably a little bit tighter than some of the other teams we've discussed. Like we talked about Buffalo being wider. I do think that they're probably going to be pretty good and not swing a whole ton. So the two numbers that we've given is probably like pretty close to the range, 58 to 62%. Probably not like, I'd be pretty shocked if it was like, I don't want to say shocked if it's out of those bounds because there's so much chaos in the NFL. But if Rodgers is healthy, I do think it's not going to swing a ton from that like neutral 60% number. As far as Rodgers himself, you've got him at 302 fantasy points. We're at 282. You're projecting a bit more efficiency there. I have some like indescribable concerns with Rodgers on this offense, I guess, where just like coming back from the Achilles thing, even though he had a ton of time, getting older, wasn't necessarily that good his last season in Green Bay. I've a touch of those concerns that's probably like layered into our Jets projections overall. But there's the flip side to what you said, which is like, if he's still very good and has a little bit of an FU season, things could go well on the plus side.
Yeah, I totally agree with you saying the pass rate's kind of this narrow band. And then I totally agree with you saying that the sort of the expectations for this is one of those things where it's like, it's really hard to capture in a projection when you're like, I see two very distinct paths for this team.
Yeah.
I see the Rodgers I see Rodgers not playing quarterback by week 8 as a possibility, right? Like, things don't go well and he just quits on the team. Like, he's just like, screw this. I'm going to go whatever. Like, he was talking about being the vice president for Robert Kennedy this offseason for a very brief amount of time. Like, we don't know where this guy's head's at. It is a meaningful point to bring up. At the same time, if he skipped OTAs and made headlines, that was weird. But if he is locked in and if he is playing at the level that I think we all think Aaron Rodgers still has arm talent and has the ability to play at a certain level, and he's physically able to, like, the other thing about this is, what if the Achilles holds him back? But if he's physically able to, they have the talent, right? They have Breece Hall, they have Garrett Wilson, they have two of the best young skill players in the league. They got a couple, ancillary pieces to build around that. Not a ton, but you could see this offense being really good. And like you said, like their win total is actually kind of high. So I guess just leaning into that win total and saying this is an optimistic projection, but yeah, there's definitely risk of ruin in this offense. We saw it last year.
Yeah. I'm looking at, I think it was Mike Clay who had them as like one of, the best rosters top to bottom. Brandon Thorne also has them with the 9th best offensive line in the league. So it is pretty good top to bottom, especially those top 2 skill players you mentioned. Then you start to run into some depth stuff that has a little bit of concern. But let's go to Breece Hall, a guy that you and I have been on since his rookie season. One of the more profitable picks you could make last year when people were really flooding the camp news. And it did take him a little time to get up to full speed. But we saw him smash last year in like a pretty bad spot. So I think he's a really safe first-round pick. If I'm in home leagues or leagues I know are a little bit running back heavy and I can get my wide receiver values later, I don't mind slotting like Bijan and Breece as high as behind Tyreek. I guess Tyreek's where I draw the line, where like all your points about Tyreek, I'm not taking these guys over Tyreek, but behind Tyreek, we were very bullish on Bijan. So I think we both agreed Bijan ahead of Breece, but that's sort of the way I look at him. So, in the right draft could be as high as, fifth overall.
I would go even higher. I mean, I think based on what you said about the home leagues, I think you could take him 2. And I am Bijan over Breece, so I would be Bijan. But I got asked this question, and we both did Reddit AMAs last week, and I got asked it in the Reddit AMA. It was like I'm in a 10-team league, and I'm trying to figure out how to navigate the 102. And I was like, honestly, I think I'd go running back because of what you can get at receiver at the 2-3 turn. the way that the home league's going to set up, you're going to get a lot of receiver value. I think those receivers are really, really good, but I also think it gets trickier to take the running back picks the rest of the way, basically. And Bijan and Breece, to me, both have this electric high-end ceiling that you can see. It's a true legendary ceiling, and there's basically only 3 guys this year that really feel like they have that, and Breece is in that conversation.
Yeah, and the way I've talked about dynasty leagues in this regard, but like even for redraft, like I want to take the running back when it's the least sacrifice possible.
Right.
So yes, I have the wide receivers ahead, but like you run into a point in these home leagues where sometimes top to bottom the running backs go so early, like James Conner's going in like the 5-6 turn, and it's like, what?
Yeah.
Like what? So if you passed on Breece and you've taken these receivers, at some point you do need a running back, and full zero RB can work, but like you're playing against lesser competition, you don't. That hero RB strategy can work a lot.
And you get to like the 8th round and you're like, I'm deciding between, I don't know, even not like the 10th round, you have like Xavier Worthy sitting there, or I have to take like, I don't know, like a hand, right?
And you can't even take them.
Yeah.
And honestly, some of the best ball it's not that far off from like the FFPC best ball. Like Brian Thomas goes in the 10th round, Roma Dunze goes in the 9th round. So like those leagues too, we'll make that sacrifice early just in the namesake of roster construction. And, I'd have a tough time doing it over Tyreek and CD, but it's probably the same tier, and it's probably a tier in home leagues ahead of Jefferson and Chase and Amon-Ra.
On the profile, Breece, ton of explosive plays last year. I think the clearer, like, elite talent profile than Bijan. We've talked a little bit, especially when we did the Atlanta episode, about how Bijan could really consolidate a lot of snaps and volume, and it could be that massive touch season and breakout season. And if you're projecting him forward, you could see this being huge for Bijan in 2024. Breece, you're a little bit worried, I think, about Rodgers playing at a little bit of a slower pace and taking the time to snap slowness, taking the play clock down. And they drafted Braylon Allen. They're more willing to substitute on drives. I do think the backups here are going to play a little more than when we're talking about Bijan. We're like, this guy could have one of the highest snap rates in the NFL at running back as well. Breece probably gives up some snaps, but I will note, I think probably a ton of receiving. He got a ton of receiving last year. A lot of it was sort of, people like to call it the PPR scam, where it's like Zach Wilson couldn't do anything else, so he's just checking down to Breece every single time. But Breece is a good receiving back. He was creating plays on those. And Rodgers has always thrown to his back. So you think about like what Aaron Jones used to do. There's some like air yard stuff there too. We were talking about with James Cook. I think we're going to see some downfield targets for Breece as well, run some wheel routes, things like that. And then the other thing is the guys that they brought in, both of the rookies, Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis, they had at least 120 catch college season, but no big like receiving numbers. It's mostly going to be Breece. I don't think those guys are going to be playing on pass downs. Like Braylon Allen is a bigger, more physical back that should substitute on early downs, but Breece maintains the high value touches, which is really exciting for his upside.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much competition behind him. Like you said, it's a couple of rookies and a year 2 player in Abanikanda who sounds like he could, be the odd man out here in this running back room, which also leads to Braylon Allen being one of the rookie running backs. Like I've been more comfortable taking late. He's a bit cheaper than some of the other backs. I know the draft capital wasn't as good as some of the other backs, but he's a bit cheaper. And prior to that draft capital, I know he was potentially like looked at as a little bit better of a prospect than the draft capital he got, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, he's really young and was really good at a really young age at Wisconsin. He came in at like age 17 or something and had like 1,200 yards in the Big Ten, which, I mean, we know early young production is great. And back that up with a strong 2022. Last year was actually his worst statistical season. And so I think that's part of the concern for a lot of people. But he's going into the NFL like an age 21 rookie, which tends to be a cohort that is a positive to target. Again, a bigger back and more of not a plotter, but more of an early down guy. He's actually still only 20. He turns 21 in January. So he's going to play his age 20 season as a rookie. With that January birthday, it'll be behind the cutoff to call it his age 21 season. Even he's one of the youngest prospects you'll ever see. But yeah, he's a guy that they're already talking about as the clear number 2. It sounds like, so he seems like the handcuff the guy that would have the most upside. If Brees were to miss time, I take a good amount of him as well. I feel very comfortable taking him.
Let's go to wide receiver. Garrett Wilson, I know, is one of your favorites. I'm a little bit more lukewarm on Wilson. But we both have him with a lot of volume from Aaron Rodgers, which, is a good thing, especially how he's utilized his receivers in the red zone. Historically, you've got him at 162 targets. We're at 147. So some discrepancy there. I'm guessing there's even more efficiency discrepancy. And another player, we talked about with the Miami backs, like try not to overly regress their efficiency. With Garrett Wilson, there's some the other way where you need to ramp up this efficiency based on what he's done in the past because of the quarterback situation that he's played with. So I'll throw it to you while I look up, get the exact efficiency that we have.
Yeah, the efficiency stuff. I mean, for me, there's not like a lot of analysis, right? Like I'm projecting Garrett Wilson to be a very different player than any of his data says, and I understand that people are like looking at the data and saying he wasn't that good and this and that. Dude. I will note that what we've seen from him.
I lost you for a hot second. I think it's me. I think you probably recorded fine. But if you want to start the Garrett Wilson thing over just in case, I apologize to people if this is repetitive.
Yeah, I was just saying that. How did I start that? I was just saying that
you're kind of just saying like it's more of a common sense thing with the efficiency increase.
There's nothing in the data. There's nothing in the numbers that would give you a reason to project. I mean, there's maybe the target earning is the one thing that I was going to talk about a little bit.
An open
there's maybe
score, I guess, a little bit.
Yeah. There's maybe some stuff in the data, but there's nothing in the like raw production, the yards and everything that's going to give you a reason to project Garrett Wilson as the superstar. And last year he was like his yards per run actually dipped from 2022. He ran, I think he led the NFL in routes. He ran a ton of routes. But what I see that as, and what I saw from the team and the way that they've handled their receiver room and they basically built around him, they see him as the clear number one. They see him as the superstar. And we know in the past, Aaron Rodgers has like had receivers like him who are really good route runners who earn a lot of volume or can win in man coverage and those things. And he tends to target them very heavily, tends to target them in the red zone very heavily. Devonta Adams, Jordy Nelson prior to that. You can go all the way back to like Greg Jennings, I guess, in the early years. And it's these guys that Rodgers is on the same page with. They're going to do the pre-snap checks, and they're going to do back shoulders, and they're going to do these timing routes and things that it consolidates the volume to the number one in a way that is very exciting. But the biggest thing for Wilson is just, can we get some efficiency? Can we get some catchable targets? I think he made it's a very much like a film take, but I think he made enough plays last year. He was open a ton. I was writing about it in Stealing Signals. I watch all the games, and I was writing about how open he was on some plays, and Zach Wilson was missing him early in the year. I remember it continued the whole season. It was maddening to watch as a guy who drafted a lot of Garrett Wilson to see him win on vertical routes down the field. And then just the pass is just not there. Right. But it does show up. If you watch the film, there's nothing really that's going to be able to say yeah, that should have been a 40-yard touchdown against Dallas in week 2 or whatever in the data. That doesn't show how open he was in the data. But I'm very in on the talent.
We've got from what our base algorithm would be, we've got a 5.2% TD rate. It would have been 3.7% without any manual interaction. 12.1 yards per catch. We've got 13. And 12.1 is, I believe, his exact average the first 2 years. So we're up a point there. Catch rate, our default algorithm is more like 59%. I think he's actually at 56.5% through the first 2 years. We're up to 62.5%. So definitely with Ben on building in this stuff. I take him at ADP. It's a super boring take, but I have him behind AJ Brown. I had a hot London. I had a Wilson take for a while, but I backed off that, and I take Wilson as the wide receiver 8. So pretty boring stuff from the end, Garrett Wilson, really.
And then mine is I'm projecting him to score more points than Jamar Chase, and he's the wide receiver 3 in my projections. I probably won't rank him that high, but I would take him. Yeah. I would take him over Amon-Ra straight up. If it came to that, but I don't have to. So that's kind of nice.
My slight concern is just some of the systemic Rodgers risk we talked about, and just seeing less paths to some of the pass rate stuff versus some of these other teams. Amon-Ra maybe not the best comparison there because I don't think their pass rate is going to be high, but for some of these other wide receivers, let's go to Mike Williams, who coming back from the knee injury sounds like he'll be brought along a little bit slowly. I think they even said it would be kind of like Brees, who Brees did end up playing week 1 last year, but clearly was not 100% at that point, didn't have his full role. So we're building in some of that, have him at 76 targets, Gretch is at 88. Yeah, I don't know how to feel about Mike Williams, to be honest. We've got him ranked ahead of ADP with what I feel like is like a conservative projection. And sometimes at that point, I just will draft a guy as a result, even though on vibes, I'm a little concerned here with kind of like an older downfield receiver coming off injury.
Is there like big reason to expect that he's going to, I mean, the injury was early in the season. Do you know where he's at in his rehab? And I mean, the way that he continues to fall, it feels like he's not going to play the first half of the year or something. Is that?
I don't think it, and the quote about him being brought along slowly, like Brees played week 1.
Right.
He just wasn't in his full role. So we're not really projecting him to miss games as more of just like a reduced role for the first quarter of the season and then pretty normal from there on out.
I've never been a huge Mike Williams guy, but emphasize that this dude used to be a 4 or 5 turn pick, and you can now get him in like the 13th round, and nobody wants to take him there. And there's not really a lot of talent concern in terms of, I mean, if he's out there, he's a high ADOT guy. He never really was able to earn the volume in the short and intermediate range with consistency. He did for a couple years, and then they kind of went back away from it, just made him into a high ADOT guy. But he wins contested catches. Yes, there's been a lot of injury, concerns, but he wins contested catches vertically. Aaron Rodgers will take those shots in one-on-one coverage. He might be the perfect quarterback for him, in my opinion, because Mike Williams is not a big separator. He's a guy who needs you to throw him open a little bit or be willing to take the shots in one-on-one coverage. And that's like Aaron Rodgers to a T. That's literally what he likes to do. He'll roll out a little bit and he'll throw a guy open, or he'll throw up in one-on-one coverage and let a guy go make a play. I mean, think about, I don't know why this is the play that comes to mind, but think about the famous Jeff Janis plays in that Arizona playoff game a few years ago, where it's just like, I'm going to throw it up to this dude. That was more of a desperation situation, but he did a lot of that stuff. He did a lot of that with Christian Watson and Christian Watson's rookie year. I mean, Mike Williams operating as a number 2 off Garrett Wilson should get some one-on-one coverages, can be efficient, I think, and has probably a really good quarterback for what a skill set is. It really just comes down to, can he be healthy and stay on the field? And as long as he's able to do that, he's better than Allen Lazard. He's better. And I know like Rodgers and Lazard have a history, but those guys aren't going to keep Mike Williams off the field. Like, I'm not saying he's the best receiver in the league, but he's a top 10 overall pick a few years back and hasn't been bad at what he does.
Yeah. You've got Malachi Corley, the rookie, coming in, who the team seems excited about, but also has noted in camp early on, like he's got to work on his route running and stuff. You've got Lazard, who history with Rodgers, as you said, but pretty dusty overall. You've got Xavier Gipson, who doesn't strike me as more than just a role player. I know that's a battle between him and Corley for the wide receiver 3 spot that people are talking about. I think Gibson's already banged up a little bit, but he's not someone who's going to earn a lot of targets, even if he does end up winning the job. So, to your point, it could be pretty concentrated offense. What are your thoughts on Corley? I know Miko for us has been pretty high on him, and I'm a little worried that I have too much Corley, but I also see the path here to just bet on a late round rookie without a ton of competition for the wide receiver 3 spot.
He hasn't been my favorite profile to target. I think I'm a little more, snake bitten by some of these big producers from smaller schools after like the Sky Moore stuff and all that. Like, it took him until he was a little bit older to put up big numbers in college at Western Kentucky. And then also just kind of the low ADOT stuff, where I try to think through like, how can he hit? Like, I wasn't trying to come out Amon-Ra a minute ago, but part of the reason I said Garrett Wilson over Amon-Ra and picked out Amon-Ra was like, I project ADOT, and I was looking at the air yards, and I'm projecting Garrett Wilson for like 500 more air yards. And that's a meaningful thing to their ceilings. And so when I think about the way that like certain rookies can hit, Malachi Corley to me seems like a lot of sort of gadgety stuff, some manufactured touches. And you want there to be more to it than that, so that he's not just like Rondale Moore. And it's like, can he actually be Debo? Everyone talks about the Debo role, right? Obviously, Debo is a very unique player with the ball in his hands and those things, but he also is able to do stuff down the field that builds out in addition to the around the line of scrimmage stuff. And maybe Corley has that in him, but I worry about the overall ceiling as it relates to like what kind of air yards he's going to get and all those things. Because to me, it's like it's Garrett Wilson and Mike Williams that are the vertical weapons, and Corley's going to get some touches around the line of scrimmage. And then when I'm starting to hear like the talk out of camp early on, that's like, we're kind of concerned about his route running, and he's got a long ways to go. And some of those conversations that are kind of implying that like Xavier Gibson might be the starting slot receiver. Yeah, I haven't taken a ton of Corley, actually. I've been pretty out on him.
Yep. We've each got him around 50-ish targets, but I do think we're both probably building in some of the rookie upside when there's a chance that Gibson, wins this job out of the gate at least. Let's go to tight end, Tyler Conklin. We've got one of our bigger discrepancies. You have him for 76 targets. You have 56. So curious thoughts there. I know early in the offseason, like Conklin was like free, and I thought it was a really good pick. And now he's more in the round like 16, 15 range. So there's not a lot of competition. There's Jeremy Ruckert behind him, who hasn't played a ton to date.
Yeah, he's been consistently good. There's this talk that like him and Rodgers have a little bit of an off the field connection, which is probably helpful. I know Levitan would probably find some type of connection there. I guess it's the ayahuasca connection or something like that. It's not a shower narrative, but it's an ayahuasca narrative, I think, in this case. But like he's been solid over the last few years. He's been consistently pretty good. There's nothing in his data that's like amazing. There's also nothing in his data that's like, well, this guy's not draftable. And at the same time, I don't wind up drafting him a lot. Like, I mean, he runs a lot of routes. He's not great. His targets per run are not great. They've never been over 18% in a season. The efficiency is good, not great. So the yards per out run is not, 1.32 last year. It's not really strong. And yet I do think he's going to run a lot of routes, and he's going to have some efficiency splashes, and he's probably one of the better late round tight ends. In my projections, he comes out a lot higher than where, he tends to slot in by ADP. Both him and then I have Juwan Johnson also coming out really high, but they're like in the Cole Kmet, Luke Musgrave range for me in terms of like total points. And there's a discount in ADP in that way. I think Kmet and Musgrave have more breakout upside, but yeah, Conklin feels locked into 75 targets, and that's a pretty good thing to get late in the tight end position.
Yeah, I think we'll probably end up widening our Conklin Ruckert gap after being a little conservative earlier in the offseason. That'll do it for us on the AFC East edition of the offseason projections special. Make sure you check out Ben's work at bengretch.substack.com. Also his podcast with Sean Siegel, Stealing Bananas. You can check out all my stuff over at Establish the Run. Ben and I will be back to record the final episode, NFC East episode 8. Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. See you next time.